Marcus Sedgwick is a multi-award-winning author with over 40 published titles to his name. In 2001, his first novel, Floodland, won the Branford Boase Award, a prize for the best debut novel for children published in the UK each year. His novel for older children, Midwinter Blood, won him the Michael L. Prince Award, America's most prestigious book prize for writing for young adults. His books have been shortlisted and nominated for over 40 other awards, and Marcus also keeps busy illustrating some of his own titles. At a recent event held at the CLPE in London, Marcus spoke with Nikki Gamble about his latest title, Snowflake AZ, a timely contemporary novel challenging ideas around health, our own and our planet's, and the stigma that persists around illness, which draws on his own experiences of chronic fatigue syndrome following his diagnosis 6 years ago.
I wonder to begin, this is a book that seems to already, even though it's recently published, have garnered quite a lot of attention. I wonder if you could start by just setting the book up for us, telling us a little bit about the story.
Yeah, I guess the simplest way of explaining this book is to say it's a book about what it is to be ill but not to be believed, i.e. you're sick with something but few people will take you seriously that you are actually ill. And that is, the reason I wrote this book is because that is something that's happened to me over the last 6 years of my life. And it's also what happened with the group of people upon whom this book is based, to a group of real people who live in the desert in Arizona. And there are many communities like this, but this is one, they're perhaps the most famous community, and they live outside of a town called Snowflake, Arizona, which immediately appealed to me, that kind of a strange name. And the name incidentally comes about because the town was founded by two Mormons 150 years ago or something, Mr. Snow and Mr. Flake, and that was how they named their town. And outside Snowflake is a group of people who have what's called multiple chemical sensitivity or environmental illness. And these are people, I think the simplest way of understanding it is that these are people who feel they have become allergic to something in the modern world, something like a paint or a pesticide or pollution of some kind or a glue or something that now triggers illness in them. And they're massively fatigued and they have headaches and rashes and all those kind of symptoms that often go with sort of chronic illness, muscle pain, joint pain, that kind of stuff. But the vast majority of doctors believe that it is at best psychosomatic and at worst that they're faking it. And that's what interested me. And I think that's the kind of fundamental thing in this book. I think it's something that we all recognise from the very earliest age as children, is that sense of injustice if you know something and someone won't believe you. That's what drives this book, I think.
In a moment we're going to hear a little bit from the novel, and there's a sense in which a lot of this is created by our modern way of living, but these illnesses, these inexplicable illnesses, have been around for years and years. Since the days of the Bible and before, when people couldn't walk and then suddenly they'd get up and walk. These are probably very similar sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you only have to look at the history of medicine, even over the last 100 years, or even perhaps going a little back a little bit further. But the number of illnesses that were thought to be essentially possession by demons, in the case of something like epilepsy, or moving on to something like tuberculosis, which was only really fully understood about 100 years ago. And now, these are all things that we now completely understand, totally accepted, fully understood. We know how to cure them, or treat them at least. And I feel like things like chronic fatigue syndrome, which you and I both have, are the kind of thing that we're just waiting to understand exactly what's going on. It's just our bad luck that we happen to be having them now. And the particular connection that I find interesting in things like tuberculosis, for example, is that back in the 19th century, it was believed there was a personality type who was more prone to get tuberculosis than anyone else. And if you read the manuscripts of the period, which I've done, there's a long list of the type of person. It was predominantly thought that women would get it. Wearing corsets would give it to you. If you were an effeminate man, you were more likely to get it. I mean, the list goes on and on. And I mention that because almost one of the first things my doctor said to me when she gave me this, I think it's a non-diagnosis, chronic fatigue syndrome, but she gave me what she called a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. She said, there's a certain type of person who gets it. And I don't know about you, but I just took that at face value when she said that to me, and it was perhaps 4 years later I actually went and looked at the research and discovered there's actually no basis for that. What was it like?
What was the type of person? Because I also had that, but for me the type of person was a perfectionist.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a perfectionist, a high achiever, a warrior, someone who never stops working, all those things. And as I said, when I finally went and looked at the evidence for this, there's kind of one disputed paper that talks about this link with perfectionism, and it's bad methodologically, and it's far from proven that there is a type of person who gets chronic fatigue syndrome. But that thing of being ill and then people telling you you're faking it or imagining it at best is a double cruelty.
Yeah. One of the things that you do mention in the book is how people often walk away. Do you think that's true, that it is really hard for people who live with sufferers?
Yeah, absolutely. The hashtag invisible illness is used a lot now about these kind of illnesses, chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and that kind of stuff. But if we're invisible, people who care for us and support us are even more invisible. And one of the saddest things about Snowflake was I didn't meet any couples, I just met individuals, many of whom their own families had basically told them they were lying, making up, disowned them. There was a lady there whose daughter hadn't spoken to her for 18 years.
How healthy did you think it was for this community to live together in that way?
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, I think we were talking about this book at the Edinburgh Festival. I was talking with Charlie Fletcher. I don't know if you read his new book yet, Boy and His Dog at the End of the World. It's again, because it's, you know, a dystopian, future, apocalyptic, you know, post-societal collapse novel, and mine's kind of the inversion of that. But, you know, there was a relationship between the two books, and I could see why we'd been put on the same event together. And we had this discussion came up about which book was the bleaker, because on the face of it, his seemed to be much more in the mould of, yes, the world's ended, but we're able to have a, you know, exciting adventure, and, you know, things work out, and although there's some, you know, scenes of cruelty in his book. And on the face of it, I was feeling mine was bleaker, but in the course of discussion, I kind of realised actually my book is full of people being nice to each other. And there's kind of one minor character who's a bit obnoxious, but otherwise there's no kind of baddie in this book. There's no antagonist. The antagonist is the poisonous world that we've created around us. So therefore you could say it's a very positive book, because it shows how in the darkest, worst moment people will support each other, and particularly because they're mostly all on their own. This kind of, and there's no formal structure there. They just have this informal network of, you know, the ones who can do a bit more go shopping for the ones who can't, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah. It's interesting because one of the questions I had was about whether you were an optimist or a pessimist. It was quite hard to tell at points through the book, and then I thought, but actually you have named, and I don't know again whether it's deliberate, but you named your main character Ash, and in Celtic tradition the ash tree is the symbol of health.
Well, I did not know
hope.
that. There you are. Brilliant. I'm going
So
to claim I know that from here on.
I guessed you would have known, because it
No,
seems
no.
a very you kind of thing. But are you an optimist or a pessimist, do you think?
I think I'm still trying to work that out, perhaps. And I think probably on the surface, I would instinctively say I'm a pessimist. Of course, I think most pessimists reply and say I'm a realist, don't they? And this is a thing, I think it's something that has bothered me my whole life, because I can remember the precise point in my life. I think I was about 7. I was on a car journey going to school one morning. I was sitting in the car, the back left. We were at a junction on the way just before the school, and I suddenly decided it would be better to be a pessimist in life, so that you were never disappointed.
Never disappointed.
And I just think these awful things, you know, the things we decide from somehow, who knows what influence at that young age, and then it can colour your whole life if you're not careful. But I think probably the true answer is I'm still trying to work that out, and not be affected by everything that you decided for yourself, or even things that were decided for you before you were even too young to think about them, things that got put upon you. And whether you can break out of that is the kind of challenges in life that I think many people don't even realise they're fighting against. And you see people who are desperately unhappy and they don't know why they're unhappy. And I think that's one of those things is, and again, I have to give credit to my wife for opening my eyes a bit on, you know, and actually there's also a lot of scientific research that now shows it's better to live optimistically. You are healthier if you live optimistically, no matter the ups and downs that everyone has in life.
Yeah. Can we have a reading from
Yes,
the novel?
Okay, here we go. Only other thing that comes back to me that very first afternoon when we got back from seeing Dr. B, I sat on the porch staring at the desert while around me, Mona and Blight and Finch were having a discussion. They weren't discussing me or being sick. I was no great news. They'd all been through what I'd been through, and not just once, but hundreds of times. Hundreds of people who doubted that they were sick, and I do mean hundreds. Doctors, friends, family. Family, I had noticed without really understanding that there were no couples in Snowflake. Not in the 40s, I mean. No families. Everyone was alone. As the time went by, I got to learn why that was. Relationships don't survive having someone with MCS. They just don't. So no, Mona and Blight and Finch weren't talking about me. They was talking about a film. They'd all watched it over at Detlef's one evening. He had a TV set behind a glass wall, which he said made it safer to do. I'd never heard of it, but it was some horror film, and they was talking about whether it was scary or not. Bly said it wasn't, and Finch said it was, but he didn't know why for sure, and Mona said it was scary, and she did know why. She said it went like this. She said whether you found it scary or not, well, it all came down to whether you was paying attention or not. At the start of the film, she said, there's a whole lot of scenes of people talking about the legend of this witch, a witch that people say lived in the woods nearby. And at the very end of the film, when the horror finally comes along, the final scene, well, it's one of the things that somebody at the start was talking about. But it only makes sense if you remember that bit, so it's only scary if you was paying attention. Then Finch said, yeah, that's it, that's right, Mona. Well, Bly just sat staring into space, and I guess he was feeling told off for not paying attention. But I could see he saw Mona had a point, because he said, maybe life's like that. And everyone said, life's like what? And he said, maybe life's only scary if you're paying attention. Finch asked Bly what he meant, and Bly said how maybe it was only when you started to learn about the world like he had from Mona that it got scary. Like before, all he thought about was being a police officer. That made sense to him, and it was all and everything he wanted. Then Mona got him thinking about other stuff, such as maybe you could think about glyphosate giving everyone cancer, or kidney problems, or destroying people's guts, or maybe you could think about antibiotic resistance, which is how all our wonderful antibiotics are starting to not work anymore, how bad bacteria are evolving faster than we can make new drugs that will kill them. How very soon we'll be back in the 19th century when simple things could kill you, like sitting on damp grass or wearing corsets. Or maybe you could think about those same antibiotics, the ones we're so precious about, and then read about how they don't only kill the bad bacteria, but the good ones too, the ones we need to be healthy, that live in our gut and do good things for us, like help make serotonin, which is what keeps you happy and what you don't got enough of if you're depressed. Or maybe you could think about all the plastic in the world's oceans, how they were saying now that every single fish that's caught has teeny particles of plastic in it that you're eating, and then come to that, how all the sea salt in the world has plastic in it too, and most of all the drinking water supplies too. Or maybe you could think about how all the insects were suddenly dying on account of pesticides used in farming, and how insects were important for the whole chain of life on Earth. And heck, did he mention climate change yet? Did he mention that the climate was changing and that we was all gonna fry? Then everyone stared out into the desert for a long time, till Finch said, screw it. You got any beer, Mona? I could sure use a beer.
Oh my gosh. And just reading the novel, it's evident that you yourself have read extensively and read a lot of science, read a lot of good science.
Yeah.
So is that a long-standing interest, or was that specifically to research for this book?
I guess I've always been interested in science. I did science A-levels, funnily enough, and didn't do English until I did it as an evening class after university. I've always had a kind of layperson's interest in science, but particularly since I became ill and I had a lot of time on my hands. And to start with, I was trying to find out what was wrong with me and reading papers about this and that and the other. But then I started noticing that although you're focusing on an individual sickness, you can't help start seeing the links to what I might call global sickness. And so the fundamental thing I'm trying to get across in the book is whatever we put out into the world will eventually come back to us, whether that's good or bad.
And I think it is a very big stage. Although it's set in just this one place in Arizona, the stage moves from the personal and it gets progressively more global as you go through. And actually that's the impression that I was left with at the end, the kind of big scale. A couple of things I wanted to ask you about the writing. I want to talk to you about how an idea because all what we've talked about so far is an idea rather than a story.
Mm-hmm.
So where did the seeds for the story come from?
The first thing I really did not want to write a book about being sick. When I first became ill, the last thing I wanted to do was even be ill, never mind think about being ill, and thirdly not write about being ill. But eventually it became obvious that I was going to have to, because it was all that was in my head. And then I wasn't intending even to write about the people in Snowflake. I went out there because I had the opportunity to at the end of an American book tour, and I just wondered if what was happening to them looked like anything like what had happened to me. And then while I was there, this guy who's in the book in disguise said to me, "You should write a book about us people." I don't think I'll do that, but it kind of stuck. Anyway, I was trying to write a book where not very much happens. Of all, you know, my books, often a lot of my books have got a really tight plot going on, and that's really not what happens in this book. You know, it's a series of incidents and events. It's the other thing I should mention is that, to be honest, is that this book is what we fancily call paying homage to, but we can be honest, is stolen from my favourite novel, which is Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann.
Right.
And that's because when I first became ill, wasn't doing very much at all, and I think it was some point within the first year, and I really was not coping with it at all well at that time. And a friend of mine, Thomas, said, you should read all those books you've always wanted to read and never had. And Magic Mountain was one of those books that I'd always intended to read because I liked Death in Venice, and I knew that it was had some connection to Death in Venice, but I didn't know what. So I read this book, and it's 700-800 page novel. It's an extraordinary work. It's now my favourite book. I'm completely obsessed with it. So on some scale, some of the incidents and some of the structural things are referencing what Thomas Mann did in The Magic Mountain. There is a little bit of story. Of the story between there's a love story between Ash and Bly, and the way that plays out, and there are some other subplots going on with some of the other characters, and then where Ash ends up at the end of the book.
I guess we don't want to talk too much about the ending, even though our audience here is mainly teachers and student teachers. But you've talked about connections with other books. I had echoes of Heart of Darkness when I read the end of that book.
Okay, that's in what way? That's interesting.
Well, the search for Kurtz.
Okay.
At the end, it just made me feel a little bit like that.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, that's nice. That came about. So there's this character called Jean Paulou in the book, and he's based on someone I never met. Who was the first person who he was an engineer who became sick. This is in real life. And he decided to move away from his job and go and build this house in the middle of the desert. And then he built another house further out because they built some power lines near the first line. First house he built, and he feels he's very strongly affected by magnetic radiation. And I never met him. But everyone told me stories about him, and it was exactly that, of the Mr. Kurtz thing of this. And I love that. I mean, all sorts of stories where it's something that is quite tricky to pull off, being told about a character for a long time before you meet them. And another example, entirely ridiculous example, is the film In Bruges, where you hear about Ari, the Ralph Fiennes character, and you only meet him about halfway through the film, but you've heard all these little hints and rumours, so then by the time you get there, you know, it's a fun thing. Yeah.
I mean, you've talked about your books being tightly structured, tightly plotted. And certainly when I read them, I mean, they're the thing that strikes you is how different they all are, but within that there's usually pattern plays a really big part. And in this novel, it's the way that you've titled your chapters, A to Z.
So that comes about because it's just one of those things that's happened with so many books, that these lovely little chance things that occur when you're putting together, or the ideas are coming to you for a book. And having then finally decided I was going to write about this bunch of people in Snowflake, Arizona, which is A to Z, as we said at the start, that I should write an alphabetical book with chapters A to Z. And I'd like those things. I've done other books where there have been little games like that, where it can seem like the tiniest, most arbitrary thing that you're working to. So, for example, in She Is Not Invisible thing with the first word of each chapter builds up to make a sentence. So when I was writing each chapter, I had the first word, regardless of what else I was going to say in that chapter. And, you know, it sounds silly, but it is really literally like the mark on a piece of paper that enables you to doodle a whole picture, whereas a blank canvas can be quite intimidating. But then I started hunting around and trying to, you know, some of the letters I already had very early on, and some I had to work a bit harder on. And some of the hardest letters, the X's and the Z's, came to me really very fortuitously, very appropriately.
They fitted very nicely, didn't they?
I always remember when I was a children's bookseller, when, you know, because the number of A to Z pitch books that we published, and you always kind of winced to find out what the X would be. Oh, it's another xylophone, you know. So I was keen to find something that was really appropriate to the book for those kind of letters. So then it's a sort of to and fro symbiotic process of you tweaking it and things falling into place.
When you're dealing with chemicals, you've got quite a lot of scope there.
That is true. Yeah, I could have had Xanax.
Do you think it's mainly for yourself? It's a kind of playful thing that helps you, or are you doing it for the reader? Do you think?
I don't know. I think the first thing to say about that is you have to do everything to please you. And I know this always sounds very arrogant, but I firmly believe you have to please yourself. And if you don't please yourself, you could write a book where you literally please no one in the world. Whereas if you write a book that pleases you, at least you know you've pleased one person, and then you can hope that there might be someone else who appreciates those ideas. Sometimes some of the games I played internally in books have literally been for myself because they're so hidden and so private and no one probably will ever spot them. And then more recently, I've decided to make some of these things a bit more explicit. And I think that, you know, if some readers spot them, that's lovely. And if another reader doesn't spot them, really doesn't matter. I hope it shouldn't matter anyway.
Well, one of the great strengths of the book is the narration and the character of Ash and how he develops and how he reveals the story, building our anticipation of what's to come, looking backwards. And the voice seems to flow as though it came intuitively. It's this kind of like an American novel.
Yeah.
I guess it's more work than you would imagine. Is it?
Writing a voice like that, yeah. The voice of Ash took a lot of work. Ash came about over a really long period of time after I decided to write this, and I was toying with who Ash could be and how to portray them. And I very quickly realised, for a technical reason that we may or may not talk about, that it needed to be in the first person. So then that gives you the voice straight up front. My wife's American. We spend a lot of time in the States. I've travelled a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit in some of the southern states doing book tour things in the past, Texas, and I've been to New Mexico and other places. And a lot of the voices of the people that I spent that time with in Snowflake wasn't very long, but I think as a writer you're kind of a sponge, and you don't have to spend very long with someone to kind of absorb something like that. And then I made Ash kind of mishmash of some of those people that I'd met down there. But it did take a lot of work. The first draft, both my editor here and in the States really weren't enjoying how it was working. And I think I'd done that. I think all voices in books are artificial, and actually we talk about realism, but it's a mistake to talk about realism because it's fiction and it doesn't work the way real life works, and things don't sound the way real life sounds. And I've done it. I made the same mistake actually with another book that I know you know, The Foreshadowing. I'd made it too realistic, and then I had to kind of pull it back to a kind of readable version of it. So that's what we spent a long time doing in the second and third draft, and then we got more American readers to look at it, so we really tried to make it as good as we could.
Yeah, because at the end of the day he's got to sound like Ash and not like a representation of somebody from Arizona.
Yeah.
So he's a character, and so it's always going to be individual and distinct. But I am interested in why the first person and what the technical issues were.
Okay, so the answer to this is that I haven't actually specified that Ash is male.
Right. Do you know, I was thinking about that. Yeah. You don't. And I suddenly thought, wow, do you know, that's really funny. I thought maybe Bly's female.
Yeah.
And then I thought, no, it says
Bly,
brother.
Yeah.
Doesn't it say two brothers?
It says that Bly is Ash's stepbrother. Yeah.
You might not want people to know that, I don't know. But
we've been talking a lot
really
about... No, we've been talking a lot about this, and with my publisher too, and very few people have spotted it. All the reviews, no one spotted it. And I'm happy for people to know it, and I'm happy to say it. I don't think I should be the person to speak about why I did that.
No.
Because there's many reasons why, and I don't want to say there's one reason why or specify any of them. And I said, there was a long period where I was thinking, could I do it? And then we were out in the States staying with our friend Susan Cooper, and she, of course, being a very wise old genius, said, this has been done before, Marcus, don't you? And recommended a book to me by Rose Macaulay called The Towers of Trebizond, which does the same thing and did it 50, 60 years ago. And so at that point I thought, I can do it, why not?
I think it's good that we don't know. That seems to suit the whole context really well.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you this one because this was a direct quotation from one of your philosophers about the limits of my language are the limits of my world.
Yes.
And I did want to ask you whether you felt that you're obviously a master of language, but do you ever feel that your language is not enough to express the things that you want to?
Yeah, again, this is a subject that we have been talking about a lot at home, and I've been talking about to other writers and people recently, because I think that's the fundamentally weird thing about writers, is that if we could say what we wanted to say in a sentence, we'd say it in a sentence, and we can't say it in a sentence, so we take 80,000 words to stumblingly approach what we want to say, and maybe we don't even really know what we want to say explicitly. So I just concluded that the writers are very confused people, because if we had much more clarity about this. And it's something, again, that I know has been with me certainly all my adult life, of the worry that we never understand each other fully. And we know that a lot of communication is non-verbal. There's a lot of other signals, emotional signals, that go into communicating, so it isn't just about the language. But even if you just think about the language, and my wife and I know this all too well, because being Maureen speaking American English and me speaking British English, we are still finding, after 10 years, points of difference where we don't understand each other. So, but even, two native speakers of a language can grow up, and even the simplest word has a whole different bunch of connotations around it that will be subtly different from someone else. So as a writer, I think, maybe you just worry too much about this stuff. You write a book to answer something within yourself. But then it is this extraordinary, I don't want to go over the top and say it's a paradox, but it is fascinating that it means anything to anyone else, and that anyone else should be at all interested in what are, after all, just the imaginary products of your own fantasy space. Why anyone else should read a book and care about it is actually quite startling. But I think it's because all of us, writers and readers, when you have all these books in your house, you're looking for something in there. Maybe not just one thing, but what that thing is. Will you ever find it? I think when you read a book that really means something to it, you feel like you've taken a step closer, and that sense of the writer understood me is really powerful. And yet, as I said, the irony there is that the writer's just trying to understand themselves. But it's good to be honest about this, because it isn't arrogant, it isn't selfish. It's actually necessary that is how it works, I think.
I do want to pass this comment on your work, that you write the books that I feel I want to read more than once, always. And I think part of that is because you get a sense of a writer searching for something through your books. I think that's possibly why they are all so very different. It's because you almost don't find the answers that you're looking for. I've got to write the next one now. And they always feel a bit existential, no matter what it is that you're writing about. That's quite a strong theme that comes through.
I don't know if you would agree, but I think a lot of people feel that good writing is writing that doesn't give you all the answers. It just makes you think about some questions. Because I'm reading this extraordinary interview between Aidan Chambers and Alan Garner from 1974. This 30-page transcription of this interview, and it touches on all sorts of things. But that has just reminded me of one of the things that Alan Garner, he makes a really clever but fine distinction between open ends and loose ends. Loose ends being, mistakes and things that you haven't probably considered, and open ends being things that are there just to not give that tight closed answer, because how can there be any single answer to a book? A book is a question, isn't it? And
book is a question. Maybe that's the question that we should end our interview with. The book is a question. Thank you so much for talking to us in the Reading Corner, Marcus.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues. Just Imagine also has a free fortnightly newsletter packed full of the latest news, CPD training, reviews and giveaways. To sign up, visit justimagine.co.uk/newsletter.